Canada controls 90% of United States wheat imports. And Mark Carney just reminded Trump what happens when you threaten the hand that feeds you. Trump slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian wheat, thinking he could force Canada to submit. Thinking American millers could simply buy from someone else. Thinking wheat was negotiable leverage in his trade war, he was catastrophically wrong. Because Carney didn't panic, didn't beg for exemptions, didn't negotiate for relief. Instead, he redirected Canadian wheat to Mexico, China, Brazil, and 60 other countries that actually want to buy it. And now, United States flour mills are scrambling to explain why bread prices jumped 11% while Canadian wheat ships south through American rail infrastructure without stopping to serve American buyers. Unit trains carrying Manitoba wheat to Mexico City, government-backed trade missions to Beijing negotiating lower tariffs, Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway celebrating diversification with Carney personally attending, Brazilian buyers replacing Argentine suppliers with Canadian spring wheat, Middle Eastern markets receiving durum shipments, North African countries signing multi-year contracts, Asian buyers outbidding American millers, and Trump quietly stopped mentioning wheat tariffs because the political cost became too obvious to defend. Trump thought wheat was a commodity he could weaponize. He permanently lost access to the supply chain American millers spent decades building. Canadian Western red spring wheat has specific protein content, gluten characteristics, and quality standards that United States mills need for flour production. Spring wheat from Saskatchewan with 14% protein, durum from Manitoba for pasta production, high-protein varieties that blend with lower-protein United States winter wheat to create flour with consistent baking properties. American millers designed facilities to process it, established quality control systems based on it, created product lines that depend on it. And Trump added $196 million in overnight costs through tariffs that solved nothing, while Canadian exporters found permanent alternatives. This isn't theory. This is happening right now. The United States imported roughly 120 million bushels of wheat from Canada annually. Canada supplied almost all of it, not because Americans were loyal to Canadian farmers, because Canadian wheat is irreplaceable for specialized flour, premium bread, and pasta production. The tariff was supposed to force Canada to accept Trump's trade demands, lower dairy tariffs, scrap digital services taxes, submit to American priorities. Instead, it proved that food security is not something you gamble with when your northern neighbor feeds your population and has 60 other buyers lined up. Today, we're showing you how Carney weaponized wheat to expose the fatal flaw in Trump's trade strategy. Why United States flour mills cannot replace Canadian imports with domestic production, even though America grows 50 million tons annually. How Carney turned Trump's tariff threat into permanent trade diversification that locks American buyers out of Canadian supply chains. And why the United States just learned that threatening Canada means higher food costs, destabilized supply chains, and watching Canadian wheat travel through American territory to serve everyone except America. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Trump actually did. In early 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian wheat entering the United States. The stated goal was forcing Canada to accept his trade demands, lower dairy market access barriers, repeal digital services taxes, remove provincial alcohol regulations, change procurement policies, adjust energy policies. 5 major demands. Carney refused every single one, not because he's stubborn, because Trump had no leverage. The tariff added costs overnight. United States wheat imports cost $784 million in 2024. The 25% tariff added $196 million. Companies importing $5 million of Canadian wheat suddenly owed $1.25 million extra. Flour mills faced a choice: pay the tariff and raise prices or find alternatives. There were no alternatives. Carney's response wasn't to negotiate for exemptions. It was to redirect Canadian wheat to markets that don't threaten tariffs every time there's a political dispute. Canada is the world's 3rd largest wheat exporter behind Russia and the European Union. Production hit 36 million tons in 2025. Exports totaled 24 million tons. Only a fraction historically went to the United States, 15 to 20% of total exports, most already shipped to over 60 countries. Indonesia buys 2 million tons, the Philippines 1.5 million, Japan 1 million, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, Iraq, Yemen, Morocco. Each wants reliable supply at reasonable prices. Carney announced Canada would double non-United States exports over the next decade. That target seemed ambitious. Then Trump kept threatening, and suddenly doubling non-US exports became urgent policy instead of distant goal. But Carney didn't stop there. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, the rail company connecting Canada and Mexico, celebrated the arrival of a unit train carrying Manitoba wheat to Mexico City. Carney personally attended, stood with railway executives and Mexican officials, called it proof that Canada has options. The symbolism was deliberate. Canadian wheat traveling through the United States without stopping, using American rail infrastructure as a land bridge while delivering product to Mexico instead of United States buyers. Mexico's President Sheinbaum negotiated tariff exemptions from Trump. Canadian farmers faced full tariffs, so Carney pivoted. Canadian wheat started shipping to Mexico at competitive prices with better quality than Argentine alternatives. China opened up as another destination. Carney negotiated deals removing tariffs on Canadian canola, seafood, and agricultural products. Part of the arrangement included wheat. China is the world's largest wheat importer, buys 10 million tons annually, mostly from Australia and France. Canadian wheat was a minor player until Trump's tariffs changed the calculation. Carney visited Beijing, met with President Xi Jinping, facilitated shipping logistics. China agreed to lower tariffs on Canadian imports. The deal wasn't about replacing the United States entirely. It was about proving Canada has alternatives. Brazil became interested. South American buyers traditionally purchase from Argentina, but Canadian wheat offers higher protein and better quality. Carney pushed trade missions, arranged logistics, made it easier for Canadian exporters to ship south instead of south of the border. The mathematical result is simple. Canada produces 36 million tons, exports 24 million tons, and historically sent 3 to 5 million tons to the United States. Lose American buyers, and Canada needs to redirect roughly 15 to 20% of exports. Mexico increased purchases by 1 million tons. China added 800,000 tons. Brazil added 600,000 tons. Middle Eastern markets absorbed 400,000 tons. North Africa took 300,000 tons. Plus, existing buyers in Asia increased volumes. The United States' share of Canadian wheat exports is falling, not because Canada is punishing America, but because Canadian farmers need reliable customers, markets that respect trade agreements, markets that pay on time and don't insult suppliers. Trump's tariff hurt Canadian sales initially, but survivors are being protected and supported while they pivot away from United States markets permanently. Here's where it gets fascinating. The wheat that used to sell to United States buyers at market rates is now selling to Mexican, Chinese, and Brazilian buyers at rates that make American mills non-competitive even without tariffs. The 25% tariff added $196 million to United States import costs. But Canadian exporters didn't just absorb that hit and wait for Trump to reverse course. They built relationships with alternative buyers who pay market prices without threatening trade wars. Those buyers now have established supply chains, signed multi-year contracts, and developed logistics infrastructure that makes Canadian wheat a permanent fixture in their markets. So, even if Trump removed tariffs tomorrow, United States mills must compete with buyers who have first-mover advantage and no history of weaponizing trade policy. Those relationships have to be maintained. Canadian exporters who spent months negotiating deals with Chinese importers, Brazilian distributors, and Mexican millers cannot abandon those partners the moment American buyers want back in, which forces a permanent restructuring. Canadian wheat for a post-United States dependency model. And Canadian farmers are accepting that restructuring because the alternative is depending on a market that proved it will impose 25% tariffs overnight for political leverage. Better to serve 60 reliable buyers than one unreliable buyer who happens to be the closest geographically. This creates a fascinating dynamic. United States flour mills are facing rising input costs because Canadian supply is redirected and domestic alternatives are insufficient. American winter wheat production is 50 million tons annually, but most is lower protein varieties unsuitable for premium bread flour or pasta. Durum production in the United States is limited. High protein spring wheat production doesn't match Canadian output. Mills need Canadian Western red spring wheat with 14% protein to blend with domestic varieties. Without it, product quality declines or costs increase, purchasing from Australia and France at higher prices, including shipping. Either way, American consumers pay more. Flour prices increased 11% in early 2025. Bread costs rose. Pasta costs rose. Baked goods costs rose. Not because of supply shortages, because tariffs increased input costs, and Canadian supply shifted to non-United States markets. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers that survived the tariff disruption now serve markets across Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and North Africa. Mexico replaced the United States as a top 3 buyer. China increased purchases by 800,000 tons year over year. Brazil is negotiating long-term contracts. These aren't spot purchases to fill temporary gaps. These are strategic relationships built on reliability. Canadian wheat shipments to Mexico use the same rail infrastructure that used to deliver to United States mills. The trains run through American territory, but the cargo doesn't stop for American buyers. It continues south to customers who don't impose surprise tariffs. The United States Trade Representative Office published 5 demands for Canada: dairy market access, digital services tax repeal, provincial alcohol bans removed, procurement policy changes, energy policy adjustments. Carney refused all 5, not as negotiating tactic, as policy position, because the leverage Trump assumed he had doesn't exist. Canada can sell wheat elsewhere. America cannot buy it elsewhere without paying significantly more from Australia, France, or Argentina. Assuming those suppliers have available capacity, which they don't at scale, the math doesn't work. United States mills need 120 million bushels from Canada. Domestic production cannot replace that volume with the correct protein specifications, and alternative suppliers are already serving existing customers at capacity. Trump keeps claiming American farmers can meet domestic demand. They're lying. Or they're ignorant of wheat protein chemistry and milling requirements. United States winter wheat production is massive, 50 million tons. But protein content averages 9 to 11%. Premium bread flour requires 13 to 14% protein. Canadian Western Red Spring wheat delivers that naturally, because prairie growing conditions produce high protein grain. Durum wheat for pasta comes primarily from Canada and North Dakota. Canada produces 5.4 million tons. North Dakota produces 1 to 2 million tons. The United States needs 3 million tons for domestic pasta production, and without Canadian durum, American pasta makers must import from Italy or Turkey at prices 30 to 40% higher, including freight. The math doesn't work without Canadian supply, and Canadian supply is being permanently redirected to buyers who don't weaponize trade policy. While United States mills struggle with rising costs, Canada is executing an export pivot that doesn't include America as a primary market. The percentage of Canadian wheat exports going to the United States dropped from 18% in 2024 to a projected 12% in 2026. That 6 percentage point drop represents roughly 1.5 million tons redirected permanently to Mexico, China, Brazil, and dozens of smaller buyers across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Mexico increased Canadian wheat purchases by 1 million tons year over year. China added 800,000 tons. Brazil's imports from Canada jumped 300%. These aren't temporary shifts to pressure Trump. These are permanent supply relationships backed by multi-year contracts, established logistics, magic consciousness, and government support on both sides. The newer markets offer something the United States doesn't: reliability. Mexico doesn't threaten trade wars weakly. China honors agricultural agreements even during broader geopolitical tensions. Brazil pays competitive prices without surprise tariffs. Middle Eastern buyers sign contracts and fulfill them. These relationships are permanent even if Trump removes wheat tariffs tomorrow, because Canadian exporters spent 2025 learning that depending on American buyers means exposure to policy volatility that can destroy margins overnight. Better to serve 60 stable customers than one unstable customer who adds 25% costs on impulse. The human cost of Trump's wheat tariff falls entirely on American consumers, bakers, and food manufacturers. The United States doesn't face a wheat shortage. America produces 50 million tons domestically, but Americans are paying more for bread, pasta, and baked goods because the specific types of wheat needed for those products come from Canada, and Trump's tariff added costs that flow directly to grocery store prices. Flour prices jumped 11% in the first quarter of 2025. The average American household spends roughly $4,000 annually on food. An 11% increase on grain-based products adds $150 to $200 per year per household. Multiply that across 130 million households. That's $20 to $25 billion in additional food costs borne by American families, because Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian wheat to gain leverage he never had. Bread manufacturers are facing impossible math. King Arthur Flour, General Mills, Bob's Red Mill all require Canadian spring wheat for premium products. Without it, they reformulate recipes, accept lower quality, or pay significantly more for Australian or French imports. Reformulation means customer complaints. Lower quality means lost market share. Higher import costs mean price increases. Consumers resist. There's no winning scenario. The National Association of Wheat Growers warned that tariffs would raise costs without helping American farmers because Canadian wheat is not replaceable with domestic production. Trump imposed the tariffs anyway, and now American bakers are explaining to customers why a loaf of premium bread costs $6 instead of $5. Pasta producers face similar pressure. Barilla, DiCecco's American operations, local artisan pasta makers, all need durum wheat. Canada supplies most of it. The tariff added 25% to costs overnight. Pasta prices rose accordingly. A box of spaghetti that cost $2.50 now costs $3 or more. Consumers notice. They blame whoever is in charge. Trump promised to lower food costs. Instead, his tariffs raised them. The administration tried blaming Canadian suppliers for price gouging. Industry groups refuted that immediately. Prices rose because tariffs added costs. Basic economics. Supply and demand didn't change. Government policy increased the cost of importing essential agricultural products, while American consumers and food manufacturers absorb higher costs. Canadian wheat farmers who survived the initial tariff shock are now positioned better than before Trump's trade war. They serve diversified international markets that pay competitive prices without political volatility. They operate with government support programs that cushion the transition. They built relationships with Mexican, Chinese, and Brazilian buyers that will last decades. And they learned a critical lesson. The United States is not a reliable trading partner when political whims override economic logic. Better to serve 60 countries at stable prices than depend on one country that weaponizes trade policy and then wonders why suppliers find alternatives. The endgame is clear. United States dependency on Canadian wheat doesn't disappear. It gets more expensive and less reliable. American flour mills still need Canadian spring wheat. Pasta makers still need Canadian durum. Bakers still need high-protein grain for premium products. But Canadian exporters no longer prioritize the United States market. They serve Mexico first, China second, Brazil third, and dozens of other buyers before considering American orders. Because Trump's tariff proved that United States buyers are unreliable partners who impose costs for political leverage. That perception is permanent. Even if Trump removed tariffs tomorrow, Canadian farmers remember that America weaponized food trade, and they diversified accordingly. Food prices in the United States don't stabilize. They rise further. Flour costs increase another 5 to 8% through 2026 as Canadian supply remains redirected. Bread prices follow. Pasta costs climb. Baked goods become luxury items for lower-income families. And Americans don't understand why food costs keep rising when inflation is supposedly under control. They just know groceries are expensive, rent is expensive, gas is expensive, and whoever promised to fix it didn't deliver. The social and economic cascade is already visible. American bakers reduce staff because revenue doesn't justify payroll at elevated flour costs. Pasta manufacturers consolidate production in fewer facilities. Small artisan food producers close because premium Canadian wheat is unavailable at reasonable prices. Industrial scale operations survive by accepting lower quality inputs or passing costs to customers. But small businesses with thin margins cannot absorb 25% tariff costs. They fail. Jobs disappear. Communities that depend on food manufacturing suffer. And the political backlash against whoever imposed the tariffs grows, with every closed bakery and every price increase at the grocery store. Canada, meanwhile, builds agricultural export relationships that serve domestic needs first, diversified international markets second, and view the United States as an unreliable customer that weaponizes trade policy and therefore doesn't deserve preferential access to Canadian resources. Carney's trade strategy isn't about punishing America, It's about protecting Canadian farmers from policy volatility. If American buyers want Canadian wheat, they compete with 60 other countries for supply. No special treatment, no assumption of access, no tolerance for surprise tariffs, market prices, or nothing. And if nothing means American consumers pay more for bread, that's a consequence of Trump's decision to gamble with food security. The $36 billion Canadian wheat harvest isn't shrinking. Production remains strong, exports continue growing, but the United States' share of those exports is falling, from 18% toward 10% and heading lower. Because every time Trump threatened tariffs, insulted Carney, or demanded submission, Canadian exporters found another buyer. Mexico's unit trains, China's tariff reductions, Brazil's quality preferences, Middle Eastern contracts, North African agreements, Asian market expansion. Each relationship is permanent infrastructure that doesn't include dependence on American buyers. Carney set a target: double non-United States exports by 2035. That seemed ambitious in 2024. Now it seems inevitable. Because Trump handed Canada the motivation to diversify, the political cover to prioritize other markets, and the proof that American trade policy is unreliable. Multi-year contracts don't sunset. Railway infrastructure doesn't reverse. Buyer relationships don't expire. Shipping logistics don't pivot back. The supply chains Canada is building with Mexico, China, Brazil, and dozens of other countries will last 30 years, not 3. Trump thought threatening wheat tariffs would force Canada to accept his trade demands. He permanently lost priority access to the wheat American mills need. He made flour more expensive, bread more costly, pasta harder to afford. He gave Canadian farmers the incentive to diversify away from United States dependency. He proved that American trade policy, under his leadership, values political theater over economic logic. And he demonstrated to the world that threatening Canada results in higher costs, destabilized supply chains, and watching Canadian resources serve everyone except America. Mark Carney stood in Mexico City celebrating a unit train of Manitoba wheat, while American flour mills scrambled to find alternatives that don't exist at comparable prices, while United States consumers absorbed 11% flour price increases, while Trump quietly stopped mentioning wheat tariffs because the political cost became indefensible. Canada paid short-term disruption costs. Some farmers struggled. Some exports declined temporarily, but Canada is emerging more diversified, more independent, and permanently positioned to serve 60 countries that respect trade agreements, instead of one country that weaponizes food security. The United States paid no short-term cost for imposing wheat tariffs. Trump collected political points from supporters who like tariff threats, but long-term cost is higher food prices, alienated agricultural trading partners, destabilized milling industry, and the permanent loss of priority access to the wheat supply. American food production depends on. Canada wins because it diversified, built reliable partnerships, and proved it doesn't need America more than America needs Canada. The United States loses because it threatened the hand that feeds it and learned too late that Canada has better options. Trump gambled with food security. Canada called the bluff. American consumers are paying the price, and Canadian wheat keeps shipping to Mexico, China, and Brazil, while American mills explain why bread costs more. The wheat harvest in Saskatchewan continues. 36 million tons serving 60 countries, just not as much to the United States anymore.